I'm Dr. Keon West of the Institute of Psychological Sciences at the University of Leeds, and I'm going to talk to you about whether or not schizophrenia is fairly represented in the media. So when you think of people with schizophrenia, what jumps to mind? Do you think of them as being nice to hang around or difficult to hang around? Do you think of them as being pleasant or unpleasant? Do you have specific ideas about whether or not someone with schizophrenia would be, let's say, dangerous or violent or unpredictable? And then I'd like to ask you, after you've thought about that, you've created an image of someone with schizophrenia in your mind, why do you think that? Where does this idea come from? Do you know many people with schizophrenia? Have you ever had an interaction with someone with schizophrenia who was then violent or dangerous or unpredictable? Or is it because of hearsay? Do you know people who know people with schizophrenia and tell you these stories? Do you have friends who work in mental health institutions or with mental health trusts? Or is it something else entirely? Have you got this idea from another source, like television or print or books or movies? And this is a very important question, and we'll be examining both people's common perceptions of people with schizophrenia and where these perceptions come from, some of the things that influence these perceptions in the rest of the podcast. So if you think that people with schizophrenia are dangerous, then you're actually in keeping with most of the British population. Crisp and colleagues did a huge study that took place in the year 2000 with a follow-up 5 years later that was then published in the British Journal of Psychiatry that showed that most people in England, most people in Britain in fact, think of people with schizophrenia as being dangerous. An overwhelming 71.3% said that yes, they think someone with schizophrenia is dangerous, whereas only about 28.7% think that someone with schizophrenia is not dangerous. So where do we get these impressions of people with schizophrenia? Very few people ever actually meet someone with schizophrenia, and even those who do are largely unaware of it, as the people with schizophrenia themselves like to keep it to themselves so as not to have to deal with these negative impressions. I'm going to cite two movies as examples of what we think about when we think about schizophrenia. The first would be the movie Psycho, which is a 1960s movie. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's a good movie to watch, but you should be aware of the stereotypes embedded in it. One of the main characters suffers not from schizophrenia, but from a very glamorized version of multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, and basically becomes a knife-wielding maniac who stabs people to death. Much later on, in 2005, you'd see the movie Hide and Seek, which is very similar to the movie Psycho, again with a very similar kind of glamorized version of a dissociative identity disorder, but this time it's an axe-wielding maniac who tries to hack people to death with an axe. So we're not making a lot of progress in terms of representations of people with mental disorders in the media. But it's not just the very sensational things, like the movies or the glamorized versions of things, but also in non-sensational print media. Some colleagues who published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, for example, found that in very non-sensationalized print media, the stereotypes of people with mental illnesses, particularly people with schizophrenia, were reconfirmed. The idea that they were dangerous or that they were unpredictable kept coming out, even for those who weren't trying to be glamorous or sensational about it. Overall, those who have studied it, such as Nairn and colleagues who published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, say that perceptions of people with schizophrenia and mental illness in general in the media remain negative and stigmatizing. That media portrayals are characterized by crime, by violence, unpredictability, and by social incompetence. Other researchers, such as Wahl, who published the book Media Madness: Public Images of Mental Illness, say that not only are these things very negative, but more than for other groups, openly offensive depictions of people with mental health disorders are accepted in the media in a way that they're not. If you could imagine an incredibly racist or sexist show in which, let's say, all black people stabbed people to death behind shower curtains, it wouldn't last very long on public television. But if you were to do the same thing with people with schizophrenia, it does last quite a long time and is generally accepted. So this is a serious problem. We have very negative messages that are widely accepted by large groups of people. Does this relate then to people's attitudes about people with schizophrenia? One study says yes. So Angermeyer and colleagues who published in the European Journal of Psychiatry, for example, they found that the more you watched television, the more negative your attitudes were toward people with schizophrenia, and the more distance you wanted between yourself and someone else with schizophrenia. This study shows that the negative perceptions of people with schizophrenia and other mental health disorders are not only embedded in the media, but that these messages come out and actually affect those people who absorb that media and make them, in turn, more negative toward people with mental health disorders. So we've talked a lot about what some people think, and we've talked a lot about why the media helps people think that kind of thing, but we haven't actually spoken about what schizophrenia really is. You'd be surprised at how many people don't know. Schizophrenia is not, as many people think, a version of dissociative identity disorder, in which you have one version of you and another version of you, kind of a Jekyll and Hyde, and then the Hyde version comes out every now and then and does terrible things while the Jekyll version is unaware of it. Schizophrenia is something else entirely. That is dissociative identity disorder. Actually, it's not. It's a very glamorized version of dissociative identity disorder. Schizophrenia is something else entirely. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder characterized by a disintegration of thought processes and emotional responsiveness. And what that manifests as, for most people, is auditory or visual hallucinations, paranoid or bizarre delusions, disorganized speech or thinking, and kind of emotional oddness, and some level of social dysfunction. I'm not going to play it down. Schizophrenia is nothing to laugh at. It's a very serious mental disorder, and it can be very debilitating if you have it. But we should be aware that it's not what we think it is if we watch the movies or if we read books about it by people who aren't writing in a scientific or serious way. It has nothing to do with shifting identities, but it does have to do with some disorganized brain function. We also have to ask, if we're going to talk about what schizophrenia really is, it's worth talking about what people with schizophrenia actually do. And I'll be upfront at this point and say the majority of people with schizophrenia do what you do. They wake up, they see their families, they make breakfast, they go to work, they eat lunch, they come home, that kind of thing. But there are some people, and I know the question does come up, is there any relationship between violence and schizophrenia? And the answer is a very tentative and careful yes. And I'll explain why it's a tentative and careful yes. If you were to ask the question, do most violent offenders have schizophrenia? The answer would be no. This is easy to test. Teplin and colleagues in 1990, for example, and many other people who followed up, they tested whether or not people in jails who have committed violent crimes have schizophrenia or not. And they found that the overwhelming majority of people who have committed these violent offenses, so much as 97.3% of them, did not have schizophrenia. A very small percentage, only 2.7%, did have schizophrenia. So no, you can say that most people who commit violent offenses do not have schizophrenia. What if we flip the question? Because schizophrenia, as we know, isn't that common. What if we ask the other question? Are most people with schizophrenia violent offenders in any way? That same study in 1990 found no, that's simply not the case. If you follow a cohort of people who have schizophrenia and you see whether or not any of them do anything violent, I think they followed them for about a year and they checked not only people with schizophrenia but people with a large number of other disorders as well as people with no disorders at all, they found that 83% of the people with schizophrenia had done nothing violent at all after they were discharged. And this is actually lower than some of the rates of other mental disorders, and actually in some cases even lower than the normal population. Now we're not going to say that this is because schizophrenia helps or it reduces the incidence of violence. We don't argue that at all. But it does show that you can't simply expect that because someone has schizophrenia that they will do something violent. That is simply not the case. And if you look at it, in that particular study, only 17% of them had done anything that could have been interpreted as violent. So the question comes up, if most people who have schizophrenia don't do violent things, and most people who do violent things don't have schizophrenia, where does this stereotype come from? Why do people believe that there's an increased risk of violence with schizophrenia? Well, this is where we get back to that very gentle and tentative yes about whether or not there's a link between violence and schizophrenia. In order to understand that, we have to understand the difference between a relative risk and an absolute risk. A relative risk focuses on how much one behavior increases the risk versus another one, or how much one characteristic increases risk relative to another one. I could give you an example in which the absolute risk is very small, but the relative risk gets much higher if you think about one thing versus another thing. Imagine that it were true. This is not true. These are made-up statistics. But imagine that if you were to drive in a car, you had a risk of crashing and dying that was about 1 in 100 million. That's not a real statistic. And then imagine that if you were to take a flight in an airplane, you have a risk of crashing and dying that's about 1 in 1 million. Now that's not actually fair to represent it, because airplanes, I think, are statistically safer than cars, or at least you're less likely to crash. But imagine with me that you have 1 in 100 million chances of crashing if you're in a car, and 1 in 1 million if you're in an airplane. What this means is that you're 100 times more likely to crash if you're in an airplane. And that sounds very scary, because it's 1 in 1 million versus 1 in 100 million. But if you actually think of the absolute numbers, they're incredibly tiny, meaning that you could take airplanes every week from now until the day you die, and you probably will not die of an airplane crash. And it's understanding that difference between a relative risk and an absolute risk that helps us understand where the stereotype comes from, but also why it's incorrect in perceiving that most people with a particular mental disorder might be violent or dangerous. If we think of it specifically relating to what we're talking about now, the relative risk of violence and schizophrenia, Teplin and colleagues found that violent offenders were 3 times as likely to have schizophrenia as members of the outside population. So this sounds huge. It sounds like people with schizophrenia are 3 times more likely to be violent, and we should be very wary of them. But in truth, the numbers were very small. What this actually meant was that only 2.7% of the violent offenders had schizophrenia, and an even smaller number, which is 0.9% of the people who are not violent offenders, had schizophrenia. What that means is that if you're not a violent offender, every 1 in 100 is someone with schizophrenia. And if you are a violent offender, almost 3, more like 2.5 in 100 would be violent offenders. But if you look at the absolute numbers, at the worst case, you still have about 97.3% of people who don't have schizophrenia and are violent offenders anyway. And that is where we lose the connection between the idea of violence and the idea of schizophrenia, by understanding the difference between relative and absolute risk.